this is our world situation is dire. I'm sorry to say. I don't want to be overly dramatic for no reason, but I do want to be suitably dramatic because these are very difficult and dangerous times, and we are extremely poorly led right now. In the United States, our policies make no sense. They are risking our safety every day, and they are risking the world's security every day. So this is extremely troubling. You mentioned the multiple challenges that we face. The world is in a dramatic time of disruption. We have hot wars. We have today's horror of Israel pulling off the wounding of several thousand people on their pagers. I've never heard of such a thing until a couple of hours ago, attacking Hezbollah and wounding apparently several thousand people. We have talk of nuclear war in Ukraine, and even our CIA director, and never trust a CIA director, period, because their job is to lie and cheat. But our CIA director saying, don't worry about nuclear war, which is just a fine thing for him to say without an explanation of why we're even talking about this risk, because it's real. So of course we should worry about it. We have the hottest year in, of course, the world's recorded history of the last 150 years, but perhaps for the last 130,000 years, actually, for the known reason that we have warmed beyond anything the Earth has seen since an earlier geologic epoch. We're just out of the range of the Earth's temperature during the entire Holocene, or period of civilization. So we have an environmental crisis, we have raging wars, we have major geopolitical tensions between, and more than tensions, but let's say tensions between the US and China, and outright war between the United States and Russia. And it is an outright war, not even just a proxy war in which Ukraine is doing the fighting, because it's quite clear there are Americans on the ground targeting missiles, attacking Russia, and it's extremely dangerous what's going on. And we're not solving any of these problems right now. This is, to me, really shocking. I'm a bipartisan complainer, by the way. I don't see any administration from certainly Clinton onward, when we've had the chance to work for peace and solve the big environmental issues, because 1992 was the year of the Earth Summit. It was it was the end of the Soviet Union. We could have had a world of peace and sustainable development, and instead we chose a war time. We chose war instead of peace, and we chose absolutely unsustainable policies and unsustainable environmental practices for the last 32 years, since 1992. So I think there are two things I could say at the start, the bad news and the good news. The bad news is the United States has provoked a great deal of this unrest and instability. The good news is, if we got our head on straight in terms of policy and work together with other countries in the world, we could actually solve the problems that we face. So the problems are not unsolvable. Even very tough problems like human-induced climate change have solutions, quite practical, albeit complex solutions of energy sector decarbonization, changes of land use, changes of agricultural practices, and so on. But the solutions exist, but we're not applying them, and certainly not applying them at scale. So what is going on? My view is we have the wrong approach to our world, and the United States is not alone in that, but I put us as actually the most destabilizing force in the world, because the U.S. has been the most powerful country in the world during the last 30 years. And so U.S. decisions have had the biggest ramifications in the world, and the government's consistent decisions have been for war rather than for peace. And remember that since the 1990s, we've been almost in nonstop war. We were at war with Iraq in 1990, the so-called First Iraq War. In 1999, we were at war with Serbia. In 2001, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan after 9/11 and stayed for 20 years of occupation. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq under false pretenses to overthrow that government. In 2011, the United States basically backed mercenaries and jihadists to overthrow the government of Syria. In the same year, the United States went to war against Libya. In 2014, the United States government overthrew the Ukrainian government. And since 2014, the U.S. has been arming and escalating a conflict in Ukraine that is an extraordinarily costly, tragic, devastating war that has claimed about 600,000 Ukrainian dead, hundreds of thousands wounded, and a significant number of Russians also dead and wounded. And now the United States is complicit in what I regard as a genocide in Gaza. It's the mass slaughter of tens of thousands of innocent people in the service of an extremist Israeli ideology, in my opinion, which is to dominate the so-called occupied territories of Palestine, which were captured by Israel in the 1967 war, and in which millions of Palestinians live, and therefore live under a very brutal and cynical Israeli occupation. And my own view is that Israel wants this as a permanent state of affairs. And of course, the Palestinians do not want to live as fifth-rate and frequently harassed and even killed non-citizens in a larger Israel. And so there is nonstop unrest. And every few years, Israel has done what they call mowing the grass, which means killing many hundreds or thousands of Palestinians. But this time is the worst, because it's probably at least 100,000 dead in Gaza so far. And perhaps when the demographers really do their forensic work, maybe a couple 100,000. We just don't know, because people are dying and not found. People are dying of disease, of deprivation, of hunger, of lack of access to basic medical services, and they're not counted in the 40,000 that's reported, but they are definitely victims of Israel's mass slaughter on a civilian population in Gaza. So we're at nonstop war. And if you go back, this is my whole life is the U.S. at war, because in the 1960s was the Vietnam War, which then we willfully dragged in Cambodia and Laos. We had the Contra Wars. We instigated the Soviet, or tricked in a way, the Soviet Union into its invasion of Afghanistan with the CIA operation in 1979. We funded Iraq to attack Iran in 1980. It's just a nonstop, extraordinarily violent approach to the world. So why is this? Well, it's not in the service of your well-being or my well-being, that's for sure. It is in the service, first of all, of an idea, which is American hegemony, that America should rule the roost, and anyone who gets in the way at their peril. So we change regimes, overthrow governments, launch coups, do covert operations, and every few years launch very overt wars, so that the people who we want to govern in America's interest are in power. That's our foreign policy. And our grand strategy, so-called, is to be the world's hegemon, the unchallenged world superpower. To my mind, it's, if I could use a non-technical term, crazy. What do we want to be the world's unchallenged power when we're 4.1% of the world population? And there's 95.9% of the world that doesn't want us to be the dominating power, that just wants peace, prosperity, and security. But we're deliberately butting our noses into everybody's business for the sake of showing who is the big policeman on the block. And it is the ultimate reason why we're in these perennial wars. Why are we in the war in Ukraine? Because the United States told Russia, we will put our military bases wherever we want, up to and including your border, the 2,100-kilometer border with Ukraine. Ukraine can join NATO if we want. You have no say in it, as if the United States would just turn away if Russia made military bases on our borders. The answer is we'd go to war over it, as Russia has done. But the United States refuses to see things from the perspective of the other side. And by the way, every time I say the U.S., I mean the U.S. security state. I don't mean the American people. They have no say in this. Nothing is explained. No truth is told. So this is not about us who are on the Zoom today. This is about decisions made by the President of the United States, the National Security Advisor, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, so-called, a nice euphemism, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the major military contractors, the Armed Services Committee in the House and the Senate. This is a small group that decides on issues of war. And for them, it's been war all the time. So it is in the service of this idea of U.S. unipolarity. It's probably also in the service of the arms contractors making a lot of money. War is business, ultimately. For us, it's a cost, but for Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, it's on the profit side. It's an income side. It's not a cost. For the American people and for the people on the receiving end of these weapons, it's a terrible cost. But for the arms contractors, it's business. And war is business. And I'm sure that this is also part of the motivation. Part of the motivation is grandeur, hubris, arrogance, and part of the motivation is greed. Let me say, none of the motivation that I can see is about security. We are not threatened by China or by Russia. We're not threatened by Palestine. we are not threatened except in one way and one way only in the United States, and that is nuclear war. And that's why everything that our government is doing is making us less safe rather than more safe. Russia does not threaten the United States in any way other than through nuclear war. And for that, it's an absolutely serious threat. So my view is, well, let's try to keep a little distance between the two sides so that we don't talk about this, rather than pressing our noses right up to their border and then having our CIA director trotted out to say, don't worry, they're not going to launch a nuclear war, as if he really knows. Because if they are threatened, they will, just like we would. And so this is the biggest mistake that we make, is that this is not about U.S. security. This is about U.S. hubris. And this is the great drama. When it comes to Israel, when it comes to any of these crises, and I'll pause here because I really would like to go to discussion, I'm setting the scene a little bit. When it comes to Ukraine, it's clear how this war could have been avoided, and it's clear how it could have been stopped on any given day. In fact, let me just recount for you that before Victoria Nuland and Hillary Clinton and others, especially Victoria Nuland then, in that moment, helped to overthrow a Ukrainian president who wanted neutrality. Until that moment, Russia had no territorial demands of any kind on Ukraine. The idea that Russia had an insatiable desire to conquer Ukraine is stupid. It's completely false. There's not a shred of evidence for it. But then we overthrew a government. Well, then problems start. So President Putin said, I'm not going to let NATO grab our naval base in Sevastopol. And Russia took back Crimea. It didn't do that before the coup. It did that after the coup. Then the eastern part of Ukraine, the two oblasts, Lugansk and Donetsk, said, we don't want to live under this coup-led government, which is really extremist Ukrainian nationalists. We're ethnic Russians. We want at least autonomy so we can use our language, our culture, and not be bothered by you who have just overthrown the government that we supported. And so these two provinces broke away. The Ukrainian army, backed by the United States, started to attack them. A peace deal was made called the Minsk Agreements. The Minsk Agreements could have ended the war, but the United States told the Ukrainian government, no need to enforce the Minsk Agreements. That's autonomy. Why would you give autonomy? You just assert your rights. And so the U.S. broke the Minsk Agreements, and war ensued for a number of years. Then in 2021, Putin said, look, you got to stop. We need to enforce the Minsk Agreements, and you need to stop pushing NATO to Ukraine. Both perfectly logical, plausible, and, my view, correct objectives. And the United States said no to both of them. Said, no, we don't have to have Ukraine follow through on promises that it's made, the Minsk Agreements. And second, no, Ukraine joining NATO is our business. It's not your business. That's literally the U.S. position, that Russia has no say in whether the U.S. military establishes missile sites and military bases along a 2,000-kilometer border. But of course it's Russia's say, as well as ours, and we should be negotiating it. But I know that the United States government did not negotiate for one moment with Putin over this issue. So this is why that war occurred. The war could have ended at any time by the United States simply saying NATO will not expand to Ukraine, saying it publicly, saying it in a way that could be put into peace settlement blessed by the United Nations, then we'd have clarity about what this is all about. But the United States refuses to do this because these people who brought on this war say until literally today, Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, just said it again, Ukraine will be part of NATO. Well, I guarantee you, Ukraine will never be part of NATO because there will be ongoing war until that idea is off the table or until we escalate to nuclear war. One of the two. So, or Ukraine is utterly defeated on the battlefield. So it's really three possibilities: perpetual war, complete defeat, or nuclear war. Take your choice. All of them are terrible compared to what is readily achievable, which is peace based on the United States stopping this push for hegemony. When it comes to the Middle East, my own view is that the two-state solution has been there on the table in international law since 1967, and Israel doesn't want it. But Israel should not have the power to veto political self-determination for the Palestinian people. Who gave Israel that power? Only Israel and the United States. So when the United States says, well, we want a two-state solution, but the two sides have to agree on it, that's fatuous. Israel does not want a Palestinian state. Then what? Oh, we say, well, Israel doesn't want it, so it's not going to happen? No. The International Court of Justice declared last month that the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights in East Jerusalem is illegal against international law. So Israel doesn't have a right of veto over this. It has the power of veto so far because the United States backs it up to the hilt. And Israel, in this government, is brutal and murderous and ready to slaughter tens or even hundreds of thousands of people for the sake of preventing a state of Palestine. So could there be peace in the Middle East? Yes, tomorrow. What it would require is not Israel's approval, but a vote of the UN Security Council that Palestine joins the UN as the 194th member state, that the borders are the 4th of June, 1967, that the capital of Palestine is in East Jerusalem, and that as necessary, the UN will put in peacekeepers or build walls to keep the two sides apart from each other, but that's just the way it's going to be. And that is how peace should come to this region. I am not holding my breath for Israel to agree on peace. And they think, why should we? We have the United States at our back. The fact of the matter is it's going to get Israel destroyed, this attitude. This is absolutely reckless because one day the United States is going to say, we're not interested because young people in this country already know how horrible this policy is, and many of us older people do as well. And so this is really an untenable, reckless gamble of Israel that's going to end up in a complete disaster. So that war could end today, not because Israel says so, but because the UN says so. Let me stop there. I think the key on conflicts is to understand them, to understand their history, to understand their underlying politics, to remember the famous dictum of von Clausewitz, who is the war theorist of Germany, who wrote in On War in 1832 that war is the continuation of politics with other means. So when you see war, think politics. When you think peace, think politics. You need a political solution to end a war. And the United States isn't looking for political solutions. It's looking for dominance. And therein lies the reason why we are in these endless wars.